Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for being with us tonight. My name is Judy Laster. I am the founder and director of the Woods Hole Film Festival. This is our 29th year. Traditionally, the Woods Hole Film Festival takes place each summer from the last Saturday of July through the first Saturday of August in Woods Hole, Massachusetts, where I am currently located. We generally screen films in 5 different venues. We generally have thousands of people running up and down the street, trying to get over the bridge before the films start. And we generally have an opportunity to have Q&As with filmmakers in person. As we all know, COVID-19 in the middle of March changed everything, and we had to quickly figure out whether or not we were going to be able to continue on, and if so, how that was going to happen. And so at the beginning of April, we decided that we would put together a virtual film festival that, as closely as possible, resembled the annual Woods Hole Film Festival that we present. So we are thrilled that we've been able to do that. It's been a tremendous amount of work. We are also thrilled that we have 187 incredible films, and we're very honored to be able to share them with you and to have so much participation by all of the filmmakers. This festival could not happen without the support of many people, particularly our sponsors. And the sponsor for this evening's film is Seafood Sam's, which is a restaurant located here in Falmouth. One of the things we are encouraging patrons to do is to go to these restaurants that are supporting us, bring home dinner, and watch a film. The festival takes place from now. Actually, we extended it through Monday, August 3rd. So you still have time to watch films. And if you haven't seen this film tonight, we know that you're going to be inspired after it to go watch it. So without further ado, we're going to bring in a filmmaker and our panelist, Hoka Kite Powell, who is a scientist at the Woods, He works in the Marine Policy Center at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution here in Woods Hole. I don't know if you want to make yourself visible, but we can't see you yet. One of the things that the Woods Hole Film Festival is known for is our connection to the scientific institutions in Woods Hole. And whenever possible, we have films about issues that people who are in the labs here at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, Marine Biological Laboratory, NOAA Fisheries, that they're working on. And over the years, we've had many, many, many films that we've screened about the issues that seem to be intractable and relatively unsolvable around fishing. The one thing that has not changed over the years is that it is an ongoing and necessary conversation. And so we're really glad that we are able to include this film in the festival this year to continue that conversation. So Darby, welcome. Why don't you give us a little bit of the backstory of how you came to make this film, and sort of what your goal was in making it.
Thanks, Judy. Thanks for having me. And thanks for having our film. The backstory is I was living in New Hampshire, Seaside, in Portsmouth, New Hampshire in the early 2010, 2011. And I just became aware of what was going on in fisheries with the fishing industry locally in New Hampshire, as well as in Gloucester, where a lot of our film takes place. I happen to know a couple of people involved in the fishing industry, and so I heard their stories. I heard the challenges that were taking place. This is it's a dynamic environment, and it seems to be never static and always changing. But, I was certainly hearing the sort of grim tales of how, so many fishermen and fishing families were hanging on and didn't know how they were going to survive. So, the other side of it was just observationally, when I had moved to Portsmouth, and, being a seafood eater myself, I had gone to one of the local seafood markets. And, what I noticed, what struck me immediately was my lack of choices for local seafood, like immediately. And just how much imported fish there were, including cod, which definitely surprised me because that's the one thing you would expect to see locally. So, I mean, you could literally see the boats right behind this market. And so I asked the guy, just what I thought was a pretty straightforward, simple question, like, so where's all the local seafood? When do I come back to get it? And, he really couldn't give me much of an answer, and his sort of unarticulated response sort of told it all. I knew there was more of a story there than what was being told. So I kind of connected the dots between the challenges that local fishing communities were experiencing, as well as just me as a seafood consumer, what I was identifying and observing, as a seafood eater. So at the time, I was working on a few different pitches, different concepts for a documentary film, and I kind of honed in on this one, and so that's kind of how it all started. Yeah.
So how long did you work on this film, and how did you decide who to feature?
So how long I worked on it? Well, the concept started, just from what I described there, sort of the background, that really started probably 10 years ago. It was probably conversationally and observationally for a couple of years that I began to grow an interest in this and what was going on, and research and read more. But it wasn't until 2013 that, I decided, like, okay, I'm going to go with this, and, created a pitch, and then, convinced my partner, Adam, to go on this journey with me. So 7 years ago. So it was really about a 6-year film in the making. And it's, in terms of who we chose, how to feature, that's just process of, a winnowing process that takes place in post that, we probably did about 50 interviews in terms of just, between people from all sides of the conversation. And what we were really trying to do from the get-go was, present a very complicated and convoluted and, combative issue, and really present everybody's different viewpoints in a way that we thought was, could explain to the viewer, give them a fair assessment of what was going on, as well as presenting all the sides. So I think, it was really just the process of, which in post was like a 2 or 3 year process, in terms of, assembling it and coming up with, scenes, and then creating the narrative. And we probably went back and forth, working on the story structure for about a year. And then, early on, we began to do some test screenings with folks that we knew in the doc world. And that was an immense help in terms of seeing what worked and what didn't work, or what was resonating with them. And so we eliminated a lot of, I don't know, maybe now I would say, for lack of a better word, extraneous, talking heads or comments. We had a lot, I mean, I won't go in, but we had a lot of really qualified people in this film on all sides, politicians and corporate, and, and within the fishing industry. And, but it was really just, we had to simplify that storyline down, like I say, and we had to make room for, to make this as much of a character film as could be, with just sort of like a hybrid character informational film. That's what we really wanted to, we were cognizant of along the way, was there was so much information to convey, and how to distill that down without losing the critical points. But involve people into the life as much as we could into the lives of the fishermen themselves, and then, you know, later in the chefs and how they're involved in a potential solution.
So I just want to bring Dr. Kite Powell into the conversation. You know, it seems like, as I said initially, and probably as you know more better than I do, these conversations have been going on for a long time. This kind of relationship that all the groups of people have with each other. People seem positioned. It's hard to really see much movement. And from the science and policy perspective, what are the ongoing issues? And when you look at a film like this, sort of, what do you think that people need to know and should know?
Yeah, thank you. I first of all want to say I have my video turned off because my internet connection is unstable, and it seems to be much worse when I have my video on. So I'm not hiding or anything. So I think that it is a problem that has been ongoing for decades, especially in New England. And what I liked about the movie, there were several things, but one of them was that it really brought home on a personal level and brought to a personal level the fact that these sort of management failures, which is really what this is, ultimately have real human costs, and that we should care about these things and care enough about them to figure out how to do a better job of managing resources like fish stocks. I think that the message that people ought to care about the seafood that they eat is a really important one and a really powerful one. And it goes beyond seafood, of course. But I think that was a really nice thing in the movie too. My view on this is that the situation with fisheries is difficult in many places around the world. In New England, it's particularly dire. But I think the film also made clear that it doesn't necessarily have to go that way, that there are other places in the world where people have faced similar issues and figured out a different way to manage things and ended up in a better place. And that, I think, is also a really important thing to highlight. If you are in a position where for whatever reason, the correct management of fisheries is important enough, it can be done right. It requires cooperation. It requires commitment to work together by the regulators and the fishing industry and everyone involved. But that can be done. It just hasn't been done in New England, unfortunately.
And so, you know, Darby, actually for both of you, why isn't it done here? We have a lot of smart people. We have a lot of data. You would think that we would be able to have a management situation that could at least advance the conversation, as opposed to, you know, it just seems to me that people just sort of talk at each other.
Yeah.
There is no line that they get across.
I can't explain the why. I'll leave that to the experts. But you know, I think we tried to demonstrate where there are potential solutions. You know, we're not trying to present that there's a silver bullet to any of this, or to pretend that it's a simpler issue than it is. It's very complex. It has a lot of moving parts, a lot of, you know, very involved constituents, and there's a lot of parties, you know, that have rightfully a lot at stake. But yeah, the Norway, you know, the reason that we went to Norway was to, you know, really feature what, through our research, what we felt has been a success story, and to contrast that with what hasn't worked here in the U.S., particularly in New England, in around cod fisheries. And so, there's that similarity too with the, with the industry in terms of Norway. And Norway's had its difficulties too. They've had their challenges, but I think overall, the takeaway should be that collaboration actually works. And, I think you heard that message reiterated by all the parties involved, fishermen and conservationists, and everyone, seems to want to have a collaborative seat at the table. Though I have no explanation as to, what the government's position in this or why it hasn't happened.
Dr. Kite-Powell, you might want to sort of talk about that a little bit, but also just for people who have joined us, if you have questions or comments, please write them into the Q&A or the chat and we'll get to them as well. So let's talk about sort of management and stock assessments and collapsing and all this kind of stuff. You hear these words all the time, yet, people look out and there's still fish out there. So they're like, okay, what's the big problem?
Yeah, I think the movie made it clear how complicated it is, or it can be, to have an accurate picture of what the status of a fish stock is in a place as large as the Gulf of Maine, let's say. The fish are mostly invisible and they're moving around, and to get an accurate estimate of how many cod are in the Gulf of Maine at a particular moment is incredibly hard to do. You can design, if you think about it carefully, you can design a process to get a reasonably good estimate of that. But if you were to design that from scratch, rationally, and looking at the experience in other countries today, I think you would be inclined to engage the fishermen directly, as is done in Norway, as is done in Iceland, as is done in many other countries where the fishing industry is a big deal, economically speaking. The reality is, in the United States, it's not. In a town like Gloucester, of course, it's a huge deal. And there are other towns like that around New England. There are towns in Alaska, towns elsewhere in the country where fishing is big. But in Norway, it's a notable fraction of the country's overall economic activity. In Iceland, it's even more pronounced. So in those places, they really pay attention to managing the fisheries extremely well. And that didn't happen here. The setup under the Magnuson-Stevenson Act and so on of process was not a collaborative one from the outset. And I think that kind of set the tracks in a way that allowed it to go off the rails over time. There's a lot that's been written about this that would take a long time to rehash. Go ahead, Darby.
Yeah, I was just going to say, we touch on how there was collaboration early on with amongst environmentalists and the fishing community when there was, a perceived challenge that they both agreed upon, but the collaboration that seems that was always missing and has certainly become more polarized was, that with the government. So I think that's, for me, that's always been a head scratcher as to, why the government has not, involved more actively fishermen, perceptions and experience and data from sea, because certainly the government can't, can only do so much when it comes to surveys. And, so.
I think, yeah, it's a good point. And I think it's worth noting that the same overall federal laws apply in other parts of the United States, like Alaska and the West Coast and the Gulf of Mexico. And the relationship between the federal regulators and the fishing industry is not as contentious, generally speaking, in those other places as it is in New England. So it doesn't have to end up this way. There are lots of historical reasons why it did. Um,
So,
I think, sorry, go ahead, Judy.
no, I was just going to welcome Adam to the conversation.
Oh yeah, hi Adam.
Go ahead. Sorry about that.
Hope everybody enjoyed the film. Glad to be here. Sorry about
Very
that.
much so, yeah. Yeah, very much so. I was particularly pleased to see toward the end of the film the focus on possible solutions to this. And the one that I am personally most directly involved with in my work is the combination of our traditional fishing communities with aquaculture operations. And I think there's a lot of promise there, a lot of potential there. No matter what we do, we're never going to satisfy, even if we start eating all the bycatch, which I think is a great idea. But we're not going to satisfy the demand for seafood in the United States from wild caught fisheries. It's just
Right.
not possible, especially not if we succeed in getting people to eat more seafood as they probably should for health reasons.
Yeah, we really tried to take this multi-pronged approach, which you point out, and I'm glad was received the way it was, and that it was clear that aquaculture and the wild catch sector really has to work harmoniously. There's a lot of third rails there too. If you start talking about aquaculture when it comes to any kind of fin fish, farm salmon or offshore pens, or we looked at a lot of different possible ways to involve aquaculture in the conversation, but it became a third rail that was disagreed. You would have a lot of different competing opinions on the matter between fishing industry, and so we tried to stick to what is working and what we know is a benefit for both health and the environment when it comes to shellfish, and so oyster harvesting and that. But as you picked up on, we really try to point the scope back at the consumer and let that, hopefully that is the takeaway. So I'm glad that you saw it that way, that we start gently moving the scope back around to them, where it is contingent upon all of us to be willing to be open to what is available to us, whether that be regionally or seasonally, locally, that can be harvested and that can be sold. And so, how that works in changing Americans' palates or openness to trying new fish. I mean, there's, we give you some examples about how it could work, but, overall, that's sort of a long-term process. And we think that the chefs, probably are at the center of that conversation, since 70% of all the seafood that we consume in this country is eaten in restaurants. So they have a big role.
I agree. And I think it is part of the solution. And people like Bart and Seaver, I think, are doing an amazing job of trying to move that process forward. I think one thing to always keep in mind there is, and there was someone in the film who said as much, is that is a project that starts at the top, at the high cost end of the seafood business. And there, it's easier to get people to pay attention to the origins of seafood, to try new things, to spend more money in order to make it possible for small-scale fishermen to make a living. We also have to remember, though, that there's a large segment of the population for whom that is a luxury. And that's true here in the United States. It's even more true when you start looking around the world in places like Africa. I happen to be active in East Africa with aquaculture projects. And it's a very different setting, very different set of priorities. People are looking for protein, not that worried about how it's grown and produced. They just need more food.
Mhm.
And so in it, you have to keep in mind that balance too, I think, when you think about the future of seafood. I think that over the course of this century, we will be looking more and more to the oceans for protein supply, for reasons that were alluded to in the film too. Seafood protein, uh, even when it is shipped twice across the Pacific, has a lower carbon footprint than a lot of the other things that we eat today. And so I think we will be looking to farm the oceans more and more. I agree with your focus on shellfish. I would add seaweed to that equation as well, um, as opposed to finfish. But I think that in general, that is one thing I would like to see change in this country. I would like to see a greater acceptance of the use of our coastal waters to farm food and other valuable products. And I think that change is coming. Even in the fishing industry, there's a growing acceptance of that as a way of supplementing their livelihood.
It is.
Yeah, go ahead. I was going to say one statistic that I think people may have missed or may not have seen is just the amount that we export from this country. I don't know if we want to sort of talk about that economic structure at all, but sorry, Adam, I interrupted you.
Adam, turn your mic up a little bit. It's hard to hear you. Or get closer, I don't know.
I was just going to say we already eat more than half the seafood that Americans eat is product of aquaculture. So the appetite's there, but it's controversial with fishermen. And the reality is, I'm not sure that even coastal fish farms are going to put the small boat American fishermen back to work. And so that was what we were struggling with as filmmakers, is to try and balance that, knowing that, the beating heart of our film is the small boat American fisherman. The appetite of America is this other conversation that we're having. And so we just tried to be real careful about what we suggested as a cure-all there, where we weren't sort of getting, like Darby said, off on a third rail.
Yeah, we didn't want to have it by omission. We didn't want to omit aquaculture as part of that conversation, but we just didn't want it. We were, cognizant of not to delve too deep into, that rabbit hole. Yeah.
No, I think you did a good job of introducing it and putting it in the context. I think that the working waterfront of Gloucester would benefit enormously if there were a thriving aquaculture industry off Cape Ann.
So for those,
and it wouldn't.
Yeah,
sorry.
I was going to say, but so let's just talk about sort of this economic structure that we are under right now. I don't know if you want to talk about the idea of how much is exported, and if the way that we relate to that changes, would that have any benefit for domestic fishermen?
Well, I don't know.
Ahead.
I would just say, for me, the amount that we import was shocking. There's a couple of things that were immediately shocking that made this film that we wanted to make, and that is just stunning, right? So not only the amount that we import, but, the lack of it, transparency into that supply chain, and certainly the lack of inspections. The inspection rate is kind of horrifying. When you consider how low it is, and then the questionable nature of what we are actually consuming, particularly with some of these farm products like shrimp. So, but at the same time, we, didn't want to scare people away from eating seafood. I mean, it's the exact opposite. And without being preachy, we didn't, we're obviously trying to direct them back towards domestic local seafood. So in terms of, the economic side of the conversation, I think, like all economics or a lot of it is local, and it should be. And, you know, so that with Max, what they're doing is sort of an interesting little micro economy where they're employing fishermen, or they're buying off of local fishing boats. They're employing, you know, seafood, oyster farmers, and they have their own processing facility. And that's probably one of the critical components, is that we just don't have the consistency here in this country to maintain processing or to keep it viable. And it's, of course, the labor issue that keeps driving countries to go to Asia to process, including Norway. You know, where Norway has, you know, this, we show you in this graph, where, you know, we have something like, I don't know, you can correct me if I'm wrong, science, but I think it's, you know, less than 1,000 metric tons of cod, and they're catching 1 million,
Yep.
right? So
Yep.
the world's bounty of cod comes from them. But 75% of what they catch, they have to send it, you know, that Norway is sending it, Iceland's sending it to China for the same reason, to be processed, and it's still cheaper. So I don't know how you fix that side of, you know, because that's globalization, as you said before, that's every industry, right? So it just searches out the cheapest labor and, you know, saves on the bottom line. I don't know. I don't know the answer to that one, you know, but I do know that, you know, there is potential in these local economies being self-sufficient if consumers were more aware and more willing to buy, you know, what is being caught. Again, that, you know, means maybe altering their taste a little bit, or being open to different varieties of fish.
More like the equivalent of farm to table for fish, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Same concept. And that's, you know, why we chose Dock to Dish. And there's a lot of CSFs out there, but it doesn't seem like they're having a lot of traction because it just doesn't have a big enough impact. You know, what Dock to Dish is doing is, you know, this restaurant supported fishery idea is sort of a next level, where, you know, you have these iconic chefs like Eric Ripert and Dan Barber. And, you know, we chose New York and LA, you know, specifically because, you know, these foodie markets were, you know, we're hoping that sort of impact amongst these big, you know, our two biggest cities, and, you know, very socially aware seafood consumers, you know, that it can begin to have, you know, some of that impact. And certainly there's restaurants that we feature that are doing, and there's a lot more.
Yep. I think that's all to the good. But again, I think you have to recognize that for many people in this country, that is a luxury that it's hard for them to justify. You know,
I think we tried to address that by juxtaposing that scene with the scene at the high school in New Hampshire, and to sort of connote the possibility that there are institutions like hospitals, schools, and even prisons that could eat a ton of seafood if it could be brought to them affordably.
Yep. I thought that was really powerful.
Yeah, it you know, like Adam says, it was definitely something we considered a lot of, and we there was a couple sort of you know, other locations, not coastal locations, that we considered sort of venturing into that part of the conversation. But ultimately, again, we kind of, you know, you're just so limited on time, you have to make certain decisions. We couldn't really venture there. But what I would say is that there are so many of these CSFs that are, you know, having a lot of success shipping, you know, daily. I mean, I'm in Texas now, you know, as of the last couple of years. So for me, like, great, I have a lot of Gulf shrimp, or, you know, red snapper if I want to pay for it. But if I want, you know, some of the fish that I love from New England, you know, I can get it. You know, if I, you know, there's a lot of these local CSFs that will ship to you direct.
Mm-hmm.
So that is an option. You know, I mean, we're doing everything that way through Amazon now, right? So, but this is a little bit more of a regional as opposed to an international, you know, footprint, right?
Yeah,
so.
That makes sense. I think the international trade issue is an interesting one. I don't think that the fact that the U.S. exports a lot of its seafood catch for processing in Asia and to some extent for consumption there, and then re-imports some of it in processed form, is having a direct negative impact on the amount of seafood being caught in the United States. It's probably helping to push the industry toward a more consolidated industrial model as opposed to family operated fishing boats. That's probably true. In order to put a stop to that, and this gets complicated. We all like the idea of the quaint fishing town with family operated fishing boats like it used to be in Gloucester. But in order to maintain that, you have to adopt rules and regulations that actively restrain the industry from consolidating. And we don't do that in the United States as a matter of course in many industrial sectors, right? We are more culturally attuned to letting the market sort things like that out. And whether you think that's good or bad, it's the way that we generally tend to do things in the US, and it has consequences. Other places don't follow that model, especially in Europe. There are places there where there are very strict rules about who can do what and at what scale. But that's a kind of philosophical conversation almost.
It seems like
Yes.
in this country, the markets are so strange in terms of how they are regulated. You know, we had all these boat buybacks. One was out like 5 or 10 years ago because of the
Yes.
economic downturn, which then probably took away the livelihoods of a lot of people who may have employed people in their families, then may have continued to have a family business. But here we just throw money at it as opposed to figuring out how to actually create something that is sustainable if our goal is to have, you know, these smaller family-run companies be able to still participate and not just have industrialized fishing. That's my feeling.
I think, yes, there have definitely been some policy missteps, and one of them was highlighted in the film, was the availability of the incentives essentially given to the US fishing industry to overcapitalize after the Magnuson-Stevenson Act was adopted, with loan subsidies for people to build more fishing boats. That led to overcapacity, and that overcapacity was very hard to manage. Everyone who put the money with those federal loan guarantees into building a fishing boat then wanted to use it to make a lot of money with it. And as the film pointed out, it was a Wild West scenario for a while. That didn't have to happen. And then later on, the government tried to fix it by buying back boats when people couldn't fish anymore. All of those things are, in retrospect, clearly not the way to do it. But it's hard. I really like the way the movie had John Bullard on tape, because I think he's a very thoughtful guy who was in an incredibly difficult position for many years there, and really, I don't know, it breaks my heart to see that ongoing tension between fishing interests and the regulators, all of whom are trying to do what they think is a good job, in a really, really almost impossible situation, and amplified now by climate change effects. So a big part of the reason I think that the cod have not come back in US waters has to now do with climate.
Certainly, yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say, yeah, John Bullard's character is one he could almost have his own like feature narrative made about him, and that guy who voluntarily steps into the middle of a shitstorm and says, you know, he's former mayor of New Bedford, but he's also, you know, got to take care of the cod and be the bad guy and tell people bad news, and he's such a lovable guy, as you mentioned. um he was a pretty amazing character. If you know, like, he's the one who actually says the title of the film. It's like the little Easter egg that sometimes you see in a movie. But you know, if there was one person that sort of personified that fish and men conundrum, it was him. And the fact that he did it with such courage and really kind of gentleness, or at least that's my interpretation. Darby might have a different one, but he he made the best he could out of a pretty messed up situation that had sort of really deep rooted problems. And he's no longer with Noah, of course. Not
I
sure
was
where.
happy that he gave us as much time and availability as he did. He definitely had a difficult, role to play. You know, I think we portrayed him. We were careful to portray him as fairly as subjective, but as fairly as we could. As you know, there's a lot of people that he was, that. Uh, it's fair to say disliked him immensely. I mean, I think he was, overall, he did, I think, try to do what he could to resolve the situation in an impossible situation. But, it's a political role, and that always plays, a part of it. So we were careful not to demonize him, nor lionize him. I think we played him, we let him speak for himself in ways that, his decisions had weight and they had consequences.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think there's a very complicated story there that's impossible to tell in a short film. And one piece of it maybe that didn't come out in the film is that at the end of the day, it's very clear that we've taken too many cod out of the ocean here, right? It's not like the government stopped people from fishing and put them out of business, and somehow the sea is teeming with cod. That, at the end of the day, is not what happened. And there were times when the regulators were concerned about the status of the cod stocks and really wanted to restrict fishing in order to let the stocks recover for all the right reasons. And the fishing industry organized politically and did end runs around the regulators by going straight to Washington and forcing greater fishing to be allowed than what probably should have been. And so it was a years-long, decades-long adversarial process that really, I don't think, reflects terribly well at the end of the day on either side. And it's tragic, especially when you consider what could have happened if it hadn't gone that way.
Yeah, fair to say. I mean, hopefully the takeaway, again, there is, the potential for some détente and to find some collaboration between those sides. I mean, it seems there's so much blood in the water now, and I don't know that there's, but, I think, you see from our fishermen, and these are well-known guys, that have been around for a long time. They're all, interestingly, very well-educated guys. They kind of defy the stereotype. I mean, Russell's is a Harvard grad. David, BU, and Frank went to BC. And I mean, these guys that could have done a lot of other things, they do this because they love it. And I think their opinions on the science side, should carry some weight. And I think, hopefully one of the takeaways would be that I think, the regulators, would be wise to begin moving in more of a direction like Norway, and find a way to consider, their depth of knowledge and their experience into how they, how they count fish, because obviously that's an impossible task. And one boat, on trawl surveys can't do it alone.
Yep, I agree.
I just want to remind the audience that we are getting toward the end. So if you do have a question, this would be a good time to ask it. Sorry, go ahead.
I'll just add to your observation there, Darby. This is true in the oyster and shellfish aquaculture industry too. There's more oyster farmers who are closet PhD marine ecologists than you'd expect. So there's a lot of interesting characters in this world, on the fishing side and on the aquaculture side, and it's a natural place for the collaboration of the industry and scientists and regulators, if the structure can be put in place to allow that and to facilitate that. And so I share your hope that that's the direction that we're going to go.
Yeah, for sure. And again, hopefully on the consumer side, that's
yes.
Hopefully building some awareness there. That's going to take some time, but
that's a good point too. And I wanted to come back to that actually. The one of the reasons we import so much seafood is because one way or another, the American consumer has been conditioned to want certain things: shrimp, cheap, frozen salmon, cheap, and tilapia, breaded white fish on a sandwich. And the most efficient way to provide that to the consumer is by importing it from other places. We don't have the ability to grow all those shrimp here in the U.S. We can't produce all that salmon, although Alaska is trying hard. And we had for many years a huge catfish farming industry, not in the ocean, but in fields down south. That has taken a hit from competition from Asia now as well.
Interesting. That sector is the one that has had some success in pushing back against imports. Some of the politicians in the South in those catfish farming states like Alabama and Mississippi, they have actually, had some interesting successes where, Pangasius, which is the Southeast Asia version of American catfish, they've been able to have it labeled or allowed it not to be labeled as, quote unquote, Asian catfish or something that, would maybe confuse the consumer. And I think that's, what we were trying to display a little bit as well, is that there's so much confusion. Even for people that are trying to pay attention and read and, well, what's the right fish to buy? And, there's so much misinformation or lack of information. It's hard, but that sector has actually had some success in pushing back against, the comparison of like, these are, the same thing, because they're not.
Yeah.
It's funny you mentioned that, Darby, because we mislabeling is another big thing that's happened in the fishing industry, and that again was another thematic that Darby and I thought inside and out about for a very long time. It was always on like the controversial is interesting list, and things that people don't know, and we wound up staying away from it because it's almost it's getting close to what you might call a third rail or its own movie.
Yeah.
But we instead opted to play with names in the trashed cashfish section, which touches more on the marketing aspect, which is sort of what Darby. The catfish is an interesting example because it's got geopolitics involved with the branding. But there are a lot of sort of sticky weeds that we had to sort of really think: do we want to get into these weeds, and how far are we willing to go to make it clear to the viewer with all the other information in science and geography and regulation that we're talking about in this film? It's only so much you can handle,
I had that same sense as I watched the movie, and I found myself kind of hoping that this was going to be the first in a series of 3 or 4 that you would end up tackling these other issues
If you can help
down the
us
road.
find some
Maybe.
funding, we're more than
Yeah, I
willing.
say find us a distributor. We'd be happy to set that up. You know.
All right.
Yeah.
All right.
Well, which brings us to one of the things that we've been doing at the Woods Hole Film Festival over the last 5 or 10 years. We've developed our Film and Science Initiative. And that is really aimed at bringing together lots of different people in the science community, the film funding community, to make sure that stories get out there and that better films about science are put out into the world. And so what we've seen is there is a great hunger for and interest in these kinds of issues. So I think your film will find a distributor, will find a home. I want to thank you for bringing it to the Woods Hole Film Festival and thank the audience tonight for joining us. Just remember, if you haven't seen the film, there's still time to see it. We extended the festival through Monday, August 3rd. And please remember to vote because all films are eligible for audience awards as well. Vote early, vote often, but only one vote counts. So I want to thank our panelists for being here. I know we could have many more and many more interesting conversations, and hopefully maybe we can bring this film back to Woods Hole when we can be in the 3-dimensional world and have you at the film festival.
We'd love that.
Yeah.
Please. Yeah, keep us in mind. Hopefully that's the case next year.
Yeah, absolutely. So thanks everyone, and I just want to say have a great evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Great to
you.
meet you all.
Yeah.
Take care.
Good night.
Bye.